dust clung to everything, a fine, gritty shroud over the town of redemption, a name whispered with bitter irony by those trapped within its confines. It was a place where hope withered like forgotten wildflowers in the scorching sun, and lives were bartered away with less thought than livestock. A blind teenage girl named Lila felt the rough plank beneath her bare feet, the splintered wood a familiar torment against her soles. Her world was a symphony of smells: stale whiskey, human sweat, the metallic tang of fear, and the faint, unsettling scent of an approaching storm. She knew the man who stood before her, not by sight, for that was a privilege denied her since birth, but by the reek of cheap spirits and the coarse tremor in his voice. Her father, Silas. He was trading her, his own flesh and blood, for a few gold coins, a transaction whispered with a chilling casualness that echoed the casual brutality of their existence. The air itself seemed to grow heavy, a premonition of irreversible change. This wasn't a choice, it was an abandonment, a final, brutal severing of the last brittle thread that tethered her to a semblance of family. She heard the clink of coins, a sound that sealed her fate, then the deep, resonant voice of the man who had bought her. It was a voice like river stones, smooth yet unyielding, carrying an authority that brooked no argument. He was a shadow made manifest, a presence that commanded respect and instilled a primal fear. Lila could sense the eyes of the townsfolk upon them, a silent jury of gawkers, their judgment a palpable weight in the dusty air. They were figures of the periphery, their faces blurred by her blindness, but their scorn, their morbid curiosity was as clear as any visual. This was the moment her old life, however wretched, dissolved into the unknown, a plunge into an abyss far more terrifying than the familiar darkness she carried within her. She was a pawn, traded in a desperate game, her heart a frantic drum against her ribs. This was not a story of rescue, not yet. It was a story of purchase, of property changing hands in the twilight of a dying town, a transaction shrouded in the opaque motives of a stranger. Her father's drunken slurs, his promises of a better life for her, a grotesque lie, were swallowed by the vast, indifferent silence of the desert. The man, a silhouette against the relentless sun, stood tall, his presence an unreadable enigma. Who was he, this dark figure who had bought her? And what chilling design did he harbor for a blind girl sold for a pittance? The question hung heavy in the air, a sword of Damocles suspended over her fragile existence. Before we get into this tale, let us know in the comments, where are you watching from, and subscribe if you want more content like this one. The reins in Elijah's hand felt like a familiar extension of his will, guiding the sturdy mare away from the squalor of redemption. Beside him, perched precariously on the saddle, was the girl, Lila. She was a bundle of raw nerves and trembling silence, her small body rigid with an apprehension that radiated from her like heat from a dying fire. He could feel it, the tremor in her slight form, the way her breath hitched, a constant reminder of the fragile life he had just acquired. The rhythmic thud of the horse's hooves against the sun-baked earth was the only music of their journey, a monotonous lullaby of escape and dread. He offered no words, no false reassurances. What could he say? That he was a good man? That this was an act of charity? Lies tasted like ash in his mouth. His past was a tapestry woven with threads of necessary violence, of choices made on the razor's edge of survival, and the shadows of those choices clung to him like a second skin. He was a man of action, not platitudes. Lila, for her part, was acutely aware of every subtle shift in the air, every whisper of the wind carrying the scent of dry earth and sagebrush. Her ears strained, sifting through the layers of sound, the distant call of a hawk, the rustle of unseen creatures in the sparse undergrowth, the heavy measured breathing of the man beside her. He carried the scent of leather and gunpowder, a stark contrast to the whiskey-soaked stench of her father. This new scent, while ominous, was also clean, sharp like a freshly honed blade. It was a smell that spoke of danger, yes, but also of vigilance, of something watchful and prepared. She clutched the rough fabric of her simple dress, her knuckles white, her mind a whirlwind of terrified questions. Where was he taking her? What did he want? Her life had been a series of small, miserable rooms, of hunger pangs, and her father's drunken rages. This open expanse, though unseen, felt vast and terrifying, a void pregnant with unspoken threats. The sun beat down relentlessly, baking the landscape in a golden haze that Lila could not see, but felt as a pervasive, oppressive heat. She imagined the endless, flat horizon, the shimmering heat haze rising from the ground, the stark silhouettes of distant mesas. Her imagination, sharpened by necessity, painted a vivid, if distorted, picture of the world around her. She focused on the vibrations through the saddle, the subtle changes in the horse's gait, trying to divine meaning from every tremor, every shift. There was a moment, just as dusk began to paint the sky with unseen colors, when the horse stumbled slightly. Elijah's hand, calloused and strong, reached out, steadying her without a word, a fleeting touch that was both startling and oddly reassuring. It was a purely functional gesture, devoid of warmth, yet it spoke of a rough competence, a capability that both frightened and, paradoxically, comforted her. He was a force, an undeniable presence, and for the first time in her life, she was completely at his mercy. The journey stretched on, a silent testament to the vastness of the land and the silent weight of unspoken intentions. Days bled into a week, each sunrise painting the sky with colors Lila could only feel as warmth upon her skin, each sunset bringing with it the chill of the desert night. They rode through landscapes both desolate and starkly beautiful, the quiet expanse of it broken only by the whispers of the wind and the creaking of leather. Elijah remained largely silent, a man carved from the rugged land itself, his answers brief, often monosyllabic. Yet a routine began to form, a fragile pattern in the wilderness. He would stop at hidden springs, their water shockingly cold against her parched lips, a small mercy in a world of harsh realities. He would share his meager rations, always ensuring she ate first, a silent offering that chipped away at the solid block of her terror. He never touched her beyond necessity, never spoke a harsh word, yet his presence was a constant, heavy weight. Lila was like a bird caught in a vast cage, her wings clipped, unable to fly, but finding that the bars, while present, were not yet closing in. She remembered her old life as a dull ache, a constant throb of hunger and fear. Her father, Silas, was a creature of habit, his days a cycle of drinking and cursing, his nights a descent into oblivion. Lila, no older than 10, huddled in a corner, listening to the slurred shouts, the crash of breaking glass, the bitter taste of an empty stomach, the cold seep of the floorboards through her thin dress. Her only comfort, a ragged doll with matted hair, its glassy eyes mirroring her own unseen world. He had never once offered her a kind word, let alone a meal before his own. This rough stranger, this gunslinger, was an enigma. He had bought her, yes, a transaction that still clawed at her insides, yet he treated her with a detached practicality that bordered on a strange, unacknowledged care. It was not kindness, not truly, but an absence of cruelty that felt like a revelation. They made camp near a cluster of jagged rocks, their shapes sharp against the unseen stars. Lila sat by the small, crackling fire, feeling its warmth on her face, listening to the soft pop of burning wood. Elijah sat opposite her, cleaning his revolver with meticulous care, the metallic clicks of the mechanism cutting through the night. She pictured the weapon, its cold steel, its lethal purpose. He was a man of violence, that much was clear, yet he was not violent towards her, not directly. The uncertainty of his intentions was a gnawing ache, but beneath it, a tiny, almost imperceptible seed of something else began to sprout. Curiosity. What had led him to this life? Why had he come for her? His very silence was an invitation to speculation, a blank canvas onto which her desperate mind projected questions, fears, and perhaps a faint flickering hope for something more than mere survival. This was a wild, untamed land, and he was its embodiment, a paradox of danger and strange, unlooked-for provision. Weeks turned into a month, then more. The vastness of the western landscape slowly becoming less a terrifying void and more a familiar, if still untamed, sanctuary. Lila learned the subtle language of Elijah's movements, the shifts in his breath, the almost imperceptible changes in his posture. His presence, once a source of paralyzing fear, had transformed into a strange, comforting constant. She could discern his mood by the way his boots crunched on the gravel, by the rhythm of his breathing as he slept by the fire. always with one ear open to the wilderness. He taught her, indirectly, the art of survival in this stark world, how to distinguish edible berries from poisonous ones by scent and texture, how to feel the subtle vibrations of animals approaching, how to listen to the wind for distant thunder. He never called it teaching. He simply did, and she, a sponge desperate for knowledge, absorbed it all. One evening, as the sun dipped below the horizon, painting the sky in fiery hues she could only imagine, a coyote's mournful howl pierced the twilight. Lila instinctively tensed, her heart quickening. Elijah, without a word, moved closer, his rifle leaning against his leg, a silent shield. She felt his body heat beside her, a radiating warmth that spoke of protection, of an unspoken guardianship. It was a fleeting moment, gone as quickly as it came, but it lodged itself deep within her memory, a powerful seed of trust in the desolate landscape of her fear. He was not a father, not a protector in the traditional sense, but something else entirely, a silent sentinel, a guardian whose methods were rough, whose motives were veiled, but whose actions spoke louder than any words. She had begun to piece together fragments of his life, not through dialogue, for that was scarce, but through observation. The meticulous care he took of his weapons, the way he scanned the horizon even when resting, the quiet competence with which he handled every challenge the wilderness presented. She overheard him muttering to himself sometimes, cryptic phrases about loose ends or debts paid, but these glimpses into his mind were like lightning flashes in the dark, illuminating nothing fully. He was a riddle, wrapped in enigma, shrouded in the silence of the plains. Yet she found herself not just surviving, but slowly, tentatively, beginning to live. Her senses, once overwhelmed by fear, now blossomed, discovering the intricate textures of bark, the varied scents of wild herbs, the subtle shifts in temperature that heralded changes in weather. She was still blind, yes, but her world was expanding, not shrinking under Elijah's quiet, watchful presence. The question of why he had bought her still lingered, a phantom limb ache, but it was now laced with a new layer of complexity, a confusing blend of dread and an emerging, inexplicable gratitude. The fragile peace they had forged, like a thin sheet of ice over a deep, dark lake, began to show its first fissures. It started subtly, with a change in Elijah's demeanor. His silence, once a comfort, grew heavier, more burdened. His movements, usually fluid and precise, became occasionally restless, fraught with an uncharacteristic tension. Lila, attuned to his every unspoken cue, felt the shift like a drop in barometric pressure before a storm. The air between them, once merely quiet, now hummed with an unspoken urgency, a nearing revelation she couldn't yet grasp. She found herself straining, not just for external sounds, but for the elusive truth hidden beneath Elijah's stoic facade. One sweltering afternoon, they stopped by a dusty, abandoned way station. The wind whistled through broken panes, carrying the ghosts of forgotten travelers. Elijah was inspecting the water pump, his back to her, when he let out a low, guttural sigh, a sound so raw and uncharacteristic that it jolted her. "Some things," he muttered, more to himself than to her, "you can't outrun. They just wait for you." The words hung in the air, heavy with a weight she could not define, but felt acutely. It was a rare glimpse into his inner world, a crack in the granite wall he had built around himself, and it terrified her, even as it sparked a deeper, more insistent curiosity. What was waiting for him? What shadowed past was finally catching up? Later, as twilight bled into night, she heard him moving about the camp, not settling for sleep. He paced, a restless animal, his boots scuffing the dry earth. She heard the soft clink of metal, distinct from his gun, then a faint rustle of old paper. Curiosity, a powerful and dangerous force, compelled her. She pretended to sleep, her breathing even, her body relaxed, but her senses were on high alert. She heard the soft click of a worn leather satchel, then the faint scent of dried ink, a smell she associated with her father's infrequent, begrudging visits to town for official papers. She risked a small, imperceptible shift, trying to angle her ear towards the sound. Elijah muttered again, his voice lower this time, almost a whisper. Should have known. Her eyes the same. The words were fragmented, nonsensical to her, yet they resonated with an unsettling familiarity. Her eyes, She was blind. What could he possibly mean? The question burned, a fiery brand pressed against the cool certainty of her budding trust. The fragile peace was shattering, giving way to a dreadful premonition of the truth lurking just beneath the surface of his guarded silence. The unknown once again loomed, more menacing than before, for it now held the distorted reflection of her own identity. The whispers of the townsfolk, carried on the wind like bitter dust, had ignited a relentless fire of questions within Lila. The words, killer, demon, troublemaker, echoed in the quiet chambers of her mind, each one a hammer blow against the fragile structure of her emerging trust. Elijah, for his part, had become even more withdrawn, his silence a shield against her unspoken inquiries. His gaze, even when unseen, felt heavier, more burdened, as if he carried the weight of the world on his shoulders, a world he was now allowing to crash down on her. The rhythmic creak of the saddle, once a familiar lullaby, now felt like the relentless ticking of a clock, counting down to an inevitable, devastating truth. She began to probe, subtly at first, through seemingly innocent questions about their journey, about the places they'd been. "Is this town like redemption?" she'd ask, her voice carefully neutral. Elijah's responses were clipped, evasive. Different dirt, same kind of folk. His terse replies only fueled her suspicion, confirming that there was a vast, unspoken narrative he guarded with fierce protectiveness. She focused on his hands, the scarred knuckles, the deep lines etched into his skin, hands that knew violence intimately, but had also tended to her with a rough, unspoken care. The irony of it, a man capable of such destruction, yet so careful with her fragile existence, was a cruel paradox. They camped by a river, its water a restless murmur, a constant counterpoint to her internal turmoil. While Elijah tended to the horses, she explored the bank, her sensitive fingers tracing the smooth, cool stones. She stumbled upon something metallic, half buried in the mud. It was a locket, tarnished and caked with dirt, but she felt its shape, an oval, with a delicate, almost floral engraving. Her fingers trembled as she pried it open. Inside, on one side, was a miniature portrait of a woman, her features impossible for Lila to discern, but the feel of the tiny brush strokes, the impression of something delicate and refined, was clear. On the other side, tucked behind a thin, almost translucent piece of paper, was a lock of braided hair, soft and fine. It felt strangely familiar, unsettlingly so. Elijah returned, and the locket fell from her grasp with a soft thud. He froze, his presence radiating an almost palpable shock. The air solidified around them, thick with unacknowledged history. Where did you find that?" His voice was a raw whisper, stripped bare of its usual guardedness, revealing a vulnerability she had never heard. The raw emotion in his tone, the sheer force of his reaction, confirmed her deepest suspicions. This locket, this tiny object, was the key. It was intimately connected to him, to his past, and to the truth she desperately, terrifyingly sought. The tension was a living thing between them, vibrating with the unspoken weight of his secret, now poised on the precipice of revelation. The locket lay between them, a small, unassuming object that had ripped open a gaping wound in Elijah's carefully constructed composure. His silence was broken, shattered by the intensity of his gaze, even though Lila could not see it. That belonged to her. His voice was hoarse, thick with a grief that resonated deep within her. He reached out, his hand hovering over the locket, then withdrew it, as if afraid to touch a ghost. "My sister, Amelia." The name, spoken with such tender reverence, was a stark contrast to the hard shell he usually wore. Lila's breath caught in her throat. Amelia. The name twisted something within her, a vague, distant echo from a place she couldn't quite remember. He began to speak, the words tumbling out, raw and unfiltered, as if a dam had finally burst. His narrative painted a picture of a past steeped in injustice and sorrow. A younger Elijah, his face unburdened by the lines of time and pain, standing beside a beautiful woman with a spirited laugh. Her eyes, he said, were the color of the deep ocean, eyes that saw beauty even in the bleakest landscapes. He spoke of their parents, freed slaves, trying to build a life in a world that refused them peace. their small farm constantly threatened by predatory landowners. Then, the tragedy. Amelia, caught in the crossfire of a petty dispute, shot down by a man who saw her only as property, less than human. The man, the local sheriff, a pillar of the community, had faced no justice. The legal system, he had learned, was a tool of oppression, not liberation. "I found him," Elijah whispered, his voice dark with memory. "The man who paid the sheriff to do his dirty work. He owed my family, not just for Amelia, but for years of torment. He owed a debt that blood couldn't wash clean." A chilling revelation began to crystallize in Lila's mind, a horrifying mosaic forming from fragments of words and the cold certainty of a name. "Silas," Elijah continued, his voice laced with a venom she had never heard. "Your father. He was that man. He owed me, owed my sister's memory, everything he had. And when he had nothing left, I came to collect what I could. A life for a life. A daughter for a sister." The words hit Lila with the force of a physical blow, stealing the air from her lungs. Her father, a monster in her eyes, had been a monster in Elijah's story too. But Elijah, he had bought her as payment, as a living testament to a debt of blood and grief. He wasn't a savior, he was a collector, a man exacting a horrifying, calculated revenge. The fragile trust she had built shattered into a million irreparable pieces, leaving behind a cold, desolate landscape of betrayal. The irony, bitter as gall, was that he hadn't saved her. He had merely transferred ownership from one tormentor to another, albeit for a different, more chilling purpose. The truth, when it finally emerged from Elijah's guarded silence, was a cold, brutal thing, sharper than any blade. It didn't set Lila free. It imprisoned her in a new, more profound cage built of betrayal and bitter revelation. Her father, the man who had sold her, had not merely been a drunkard and a brute. He had been an architect of suffering, a perpetrator of a heinous crime that had stained Elijah's soul and stolen his sister's life. And Elijah, the man who had offered her a semblance of protection, a glimmer of rough care, was not a rescuer but an avenger. A man whose hands, though they had provided for her, were stained with the complex, unsettling purpose of retribution. She was not a daughter. She was a payment, a living embodiment of a debt owed, a pawn in a grim familial vendetta. The air between them was thick with the weight of it, an unspoken chasm that had opened, wider than any canyon they had traversed. Lila could feel the silence stretching, taut and brittle like old parchment about to tear. Her mind reeled, sifting through every interaction, every sparse word, every rough act of provision. Had his kindness been a calculated part of the deal? Had his quiet protection been merely the careful maintenance of property? The questions spun in a dizzying vortex, each answer more devastating than the last. The warmth of the campfire seemed to recede, replaced by an internal chill that seeped into her very bones. Elijah stood, his back to her, a silhouette against the dying embers of their shared, shattered illusion. He offered no apology, no justification, just the heavy silence of a man who had finally unburdened a terrible truth, regardless of the cost. He was a deeply flawed man, shaped by the brutal injustices of his world, driven by a grief that had festered into a vengeful purpose. His moral compass, twisted by the unbearable weight of his sister's murder, pointed not towards redemption, but towards retribution, a bleak form of justice in a lawless land. His voice, when it finally came, was low, almost a growl. "I saw her eyes, Lila. Even blind, I saw her in you, the same spirit, the same vulnerability. It wasn't just about Silas. It was about something more, something I had to protect, even if it was through this." His words were an attempt at explanation, not absolution, an offering of his fractured truth, but the damage was done. The initial shock began to recede, leaving behind a searing pain and a new, unsettling clarity. She was alone again, truly alone, adrift in a world where even the most fundamental acts of good were tainted by hidden dark agendas. The silence that followed Elijah's stark confession stretched into the small hours of the morning, broken only by the soft, persistent murmur of the river. Lila sat unmoving, the revelation a heavy cloak draped over her, chilling her to the core. The sun, when it finally rose, spilled its warm light over the landscape, but it could not dispel the internal chill that had settled within her. The world, once slowly expanding under Elijah's strange guardianship, now felt vast and terrifyingly empty. She was no longer simply a blind girl. She was a living ledger, a stark reminder of a brutal transaction, a symbol of vengeance. Yet within that desolate understanding, something else stirred, a defiant ember of resolve. Elijah was gone when the sun crested the horizon, leaving only the faintest impression in the dust where he had slept. His horse was gone, his saddlebags, his rifle. He had left her, not with money, not with a guide, but with his truth, a truth that had ripped open her world, but had also, perhaps unintentionally, given her a profound, albeit painful gift, a reason to truly fight for herself. He was a ghost now, another chapter closed, leaving her with the stark choice of succumbing to the cold weight of his revelation or forging her own path from the ashes of his bitter legacy. He was a man consumed by the past, trapped by his grief and his need for retribution. His final act of leaving her was perhaps his only true kindness, a relinquishing of his claim. Lila stood, her hands finding the familiar textures of the ground beneath her bare feet. She felt the warmth of the sun on her face, heard the distant call of a bird. Her senses, honed by months of relying solely on them, were now her greatest allies. The locket, clutched tight in her hand, was no longer just a symbol of a past crime. It was a testament to the intricate, often brutal connections that bound people. Amelia's hair, soft and delicate, now felt like a fragile promise of agency. Her life with Elijah had been a dark, winding path, but it had also forged her, tempered her spirit. She was no longer the trembling child sold by her father. She was a survivor, etched by sorrow but not broken by it. The path ahead was unseen, uncertain, fraught with challenges, yet for the first time it was truly her own. She carried the weight of Elijah's truth, a somber legacy, but also the resilient strength born of enduring such a dark journey. Her blindness, once a prison, was now a lens through which she perceived the world with a heightened clarity, a world that was both cruel and capable of unexpected, even if painful lessons. She took a breath, deep and steady, and began to walk, not towards any destination known to her, but towards the faint, flickering light of a future she would build for herself, one step at a time, guided by the unseen world and the quiet, fierce pulse of her own defiant heart. The sun, a silent witness, continued its slow ascent, promising a new day, however grim, however uncertain, filled with the raw potential of her own making.